Dear learners, I am Dr. Preeti Khalila Rajkhwa. I welcome you all to this session. Today's lecture focuses on an important and increasingly relevant concept in heritage studies and tourism management, that is, adaptive reuse and tourism. Traditionally, tourism was associated with leisure, sightseeing, and entertainment. However, contemporary tourism increasingly emphasizes heritage, sustainability, cultural identity, and responsible development. In this context, adaptive reuse has emerged as a key strategy for conserving heritage while simultaneously supporting tourism. Across the world, we find historic buildings that have lost their original function. Palaces no longer housing royalty, factories no longer producing goods, forts no longer used for defenses, or colonial buildings no longer serving as administrative purposes. The question arises, should these structures be demolished, frozen, or monuments, or creatively reused? Adaptive reuse provides a powerful answer. It allows historic structure to be repurposed for new uses while preserving their heritage value. In tourism, this approach helps transform unused or underused heritage into living species of experience, rather than static relics of the past. This lecture will explore the concept and meaning of adaptive reuse, its relationship with tourism, then its role in sustainability and heritage conservation, India and global case studies, then ethical challenges and future directions. Firstly, we shall discuss the concept and meaning of adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is a significant concept in the field of heritage conservation, architecture, urban planning, and tourism studies. It refers to the process of reusing an existing building or historic structure for a new purpose that is different from the original function, while retaining its essential architectural, historical, cultural, and social values. Instead of demolishing old buildings, adaptive reuse seeks to give them a new life, new look by integrating contemporary needs with historic character. At its core, adaptive reuse represents a balanced approach between conservation and development. It acknowledges that cities and societies are dynamic and that buildings, like cultures, must evolve over time. However, this evaluation does not imply erasing the past. Rather, adaptive reuse ensures that the physical fabric and symbolic meaning of heritage structures are preserved even as they are adapted to modern use. Traditionally, historic buildings were preserved primarily as monuments or museums, often disconnected from everyday life. While preservation protects architectural integrity, it may render heritage economically unviable or socially isolated. Adaptive reuse emerged as an alternative approach that emphasizes continued use as a key strategy for conservation. A building that is used, maintained, and valued by people is more likely to survive than one that is abandoned or locked away. Adaptive reuse is based on the idea that use value and heritage value can coexist. For example, a palace may no longer function as a royal residence, but it can successfully serve as a heritage hotel. A factory may no longer produce goods, but it can be transformed into a museum or cultural center. In each case, the original structure remains intact, but its function changes to suit contemporary socio-economic realities. In heritage conservation, adaptive reuse is understood as a non-destructive intervention. one cannot restrict the originality of the heritage. It avoids drastic alternation that would compromise the authenticity or integrity of the structure. The aim is not to modernize heritage indiscriminately, but to respect the original design, materials, spatial organization, and historical context while introducing necessary modifications. Adaptive reuse differs from preservation, which focuses on maintaining a structure in its existing form. Then restoration, which attempts to return a building to a specific historical period. Then restoration, which involves rebuilding lost or damaged structure. Unlike these approaches, adaptive reuse allows for functional change, making heritage responsive to present needs. Adaptive reuse as a response to change. The need for adaptive reuse often arises when buildings became functionally obsolete. Political change, economic decline, industrialization, deindustrialization, and technological advancement can all render buildings spare. Rather than viewing such buildings as liabilities, adaptive reuse treats them as cultural assets with redevelopment potential. For instance, colonial administrative buildings may lose relevance after independence. Industrial mills may shut down due to economic reconstructing, and traditional resistance may no longer suit modern lifestyles. Adaptive reuse enables these structures to remain relevant by assigning them new roles without erasing their historical narratives. Then social and cultural dimensions. Beyond architecture, adaptive reuse has strong social and cultural implications. Historic buildings carry collective memories, identities, and meanings. By reusing them, societies maintain a tangible connection with their past. Adaptive reuse allows communities to interact with heritage in everyday life, rather than encountering it only in textbooks or museums. From a tourism perspective, this lived experience of heritage enhances authenticity. Visitors are not merely observing history, they are inhabiting historic spaces. Sleeping in heritage hotels, dining in restored buildings, or attending cultural events in repurposed venues. Then, economic and sustainable meaning. Adaptive reuse also carries important economic and sustainability related meanings. It is often more cost effective than new constructions and supports sustainable development by reducing waste and conserving resources. In tourism, adaptive reuse transforms heritage into an income generating resource, ensuring funds for its maintenance and long-term survival. Thus, adaptive reuse signifies a shift from viewing heritage as a financial burden to recognizing it as a producing cultural resources. Now moving to the evolution of adaptive reuse in tourism. The evolution of adaptive reuse in tourism is closely linked to broader changes in heritage conservation, philosophy, urban development, industrial transformations, and tourist behavior. Over time, tourism has shifted from a focus on leisure and novelty to an emphasis on heritage, authenticity, sustainability, and experimental travel. Adaptive reuse emerged within this context as a practical and ideological responses to the challenges of preserving historic structure while meeting contemporary tourism demands. Early attitude: preservation without use. In the early stages of heritage conservation, particularly during the 19th and early 20th century, historic buildings were primarily treated as monuments to be preserved, rather than spheres to be actively used. Conservation efforts focused on protecting architectural authenticities and historical importance, often isolated heritage structures from everyday life. In tourism, such sites functioned mainly as aesthetic attractions, visited briefly for sightseeing or educational purposes. Although this approach helped promote important monuments, it often resulted in underutilized buildings with limited economic sustainability. Many heritage structures fell into neglect due to lack of regular use and insufficient financial resources for maintenance. Post-war urban change and functional obsolescence. After the World War II, rapid urbanization, industrial restructuring, and technological advancement led to widespread functional obsolescence of historic buildings. Factories closed, junkyard declined, colonial administrative buildings lost relevance, and traditional residents no longer met modern living standards. This development posed serious challenges for cities with large stock of historic structures. During this period, tourism planners and urban authorities began to explore alternative ways to reuse existing buildings rather than demolish them. The idea of adaptive reuse gained traction as a means to conserve heritage while addressing economic decline, especially in historic cities, centers, and industrial zones. Then, rise of cultural and heritage tourism. From the late 20th century onwards, tourism underwent a major transformation with the growth of cultural and heritage tourism. Tourists increasingly sought meaningful experiences, authenticity, and engagement with the local history and culture. This change in tourist demand created opportunities for adaptive reuse. Historic buildings were repurposed as heritage hotels, museums and interpretation centers, cultural venues and galleries, cafes, restaurants, and boutique spaces. These reuse structures offer tourists a unique experience of living within the history, rather than merely observing it. Adaptive reuse thus became an effective strategy to enhance destination appeal while conserving heritage assets. With a global emphasis on sustainable development in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, adaptive reuse became firmly embedded in tourism planning. Sustainability highlighted the need to reduce environmental impact, conserve resources, and promote long-term economic viability. Adaptive reuse align naturally with these goals by reducing demolition and construction waste, then minimizing environmental footprints, revitalizing existing urban areas, then supporting local economies and communities. International organizations such as UNESCO and International Council on Monuments and Sites encouraged adaptive reuse as part of integrated tourism management and sustainable tourism practices. In recent decades, adaptive reuse has expanded beyond traditional monuments into industrial heritage and dark tourism sites. Former prisons, battlefields, factories, mines, and conflict-related structures have been reused as museums, memorials, and tourism attractions. These sites allow visitors to engage critically with difficult histories while ensuring the preservation of structures that might otherwise disappear. Such reuse reflects a broader understanding of heritage not only as guard architecture but also as a species of memory, labor, and trauma. Then contemporary trends and experimental tourism. In the present era, adaptive reuse in tourism is strongly linked with experimental and creative tourism. Reused heritage spaces now host cultural performances, workshops, exhibitions, and community-led tourism initiatives. Digital interpretation, storytelling, and immense experiences have further enhanced the tourism potential of adaptively reused sites. Adaptive reuse is a tool for sustainable tourism. Adaptive reuse has emerged as a vital tool for promoting sustainable tourism, as it integrates heritage conservation with economic development, environmental responsibility, and socio-cultural preservation. Sustainable tourism aims to meet the need of present tourists and host communities while safeguarding resources for future generations. Adaptive reuse aligns closely with this objective by ensuring the productive and responsible use of existing heritage assets rather than relying on new constructions and resource-intensive development. Then environmental sustainability. One of the most significant contributions of adaptive reuse to sustainable tourism lies in its environmental benefits. Reusing existing buildings reduces the need for demolition and new constructions, thereby minimizing construction waste and conserving natural resources. Historic structures often embody substantial amount of energy in their materials and constructions. Adaptive reuse helps preserve this embedded energy. By utilizing existing infrastructure such as roads, utilities, and public spaces, adaptive reuse lowers the environmental footprint of tourism development. It also limits urban sprawl and reduces pressure on natural landscapes, particularly in heritage-rich cities and fragile destinations. In this way, adaptive reuse supports low-impact tourism development. Then economic sustainability. Adaptive reuse transforms heritage buildings into economically viable tourism resources. When historic structures were converted into hotels, museums, cultural centers, or interpretation spaces, these generate revenue that can be reinvested in maintenance and conservation. This economic viability ensures the long-term survival of heritage assets. Moreover, adaptive reuse promotes local employment and entrepreneurship. It creates jobs in conservation, hospitality, guiding services, crafts, and cultural industries. Unlike mass tourism infrastructure, adaptively reused sites often encourage small-scale local-owned businesses, strengthening the local economy and reducing economic leakage. Then socio-cultural sustainability. Adaptive reuse plays a crucial role in preserving cultural identity and collective memory. Historic buildings were repositories of local history, traditions, and social values. By maintaining their physical presence and adapting them for contemporary use, communities remain connected to their heritage. Community participation and inclusiveness. A sustainable approach to adaptive reuse emphasizes community involvement in planning by implementation. When local communities participate in decision-making, adaptive reuse projects are more likely to reflect local needs and values. Community-led reuse initiatives such as homestays, craft centers, or cultural hubs empower residents and ensure that tourism benefits are equally distributed among the local people. Conservation through continued use. Adaptive reuse supports the principle that heritage is best conserved when it remains in active use. Buildings that serve functional purposes are more likely to receive regular maintenance and public attention. In contrast, abandoned or purely monumental structures often deteriorate due to neglect. Tourism provides a practical framework for continued use, ensuring both conservation and accessibility. Adaptive reuse thus bridges the gap between preservation and development, making heritage conservation financially and socially sustainable. Then policy and planning implications. Adaptive reuse as a tool for sustainable tourism requires supportive policies, conservation guidelines, and integrated planning. Government, heritage agencies, and tourism authorities must collaborate to ensure that reused projects respect, firstly, authenticity, follow conservation ethics, and ally with sustainability goals. Public-private partnership, incentives for conservation, and capacity building initiatives further strengthen adaptive reuse efforts within the tourism planning. Now we shall discuss the types of adaptive reuse in tourism. Adaptive reuse in tourism can take various forms depending on nature of the heritage structure, its location, historical significance, and the need of the tourism market. By assigning new tourism-related functions to old or historic buildings, adaptive reuse ensures both heritage conservation and sustainable destination development. The major types of adaptive reuse in tourism are 1. Heritage hotels or accommodations. One of the most popular forms of adaptive reuse in tourism is the conservation of historic buildings into heritage hotels, resorts, and guest houses. Palaces, forts, havelis, colonial bungalows, monasteries, and traditional residences that have lost their original residential function are repurposed to provide accommodation. These properties allow tourists to experience history through living spaces, combining traditional architecture with modern amenities. Heritage hotels generate substantial revenue, support conservation costs, and create employment opportunity, particularly in heritage-rich regions such as Rajasthan and Kerala. This form of adaptive reuse also enhances destination image by offering unique and authentic experiences. Then, secondly, the museums and interpretation centers. Many historic buildings are adaptively reused as museums, memorials, and interpretation centers. These may include palaces, forts, administrative buildings, factories, or military structures that are no longer functional. By converting such structures into museums, tourism planners ensure public access to heritage while preserving historical narratives. Interpretation centers provide educational value by explaining the historical, cultural, or industrial significance of the site. This type of adaptive reuse is particularly important in educational tourism and cultural tourism. Then, cultural and creative spaces. Adaptive reuse has increasingly been applied to create cultural and creative tourism spaces. Old warehouses, mills, theaters, and urban heritage buildings are transformed into art galleries, performance venues, exhibition halls, and creative studios. These spaces host festivals, workshops, craft markets, and cultural performances, attracting both tourists and local residents. Such reuse promotes creative tourism, encourages cultural production, and revitalizes urban heritage areas without erasing their historical character. Then, industrial heritage tourism. Industrial structures such as factories, mines, power plants, dockyard, and railway infrastructure often became obstacles due to economic and technological changes. Adaptive reuse converts these sites into tourism attractions, museums, or cultural complexes, highlighting the history of labor, technology, and industrialization. Industrial heritage tourism offers visitors insight into the socio-economic transformations of the region while preserving important historical landscape. This type of adaptive reuse is increasingly recognized for its educational and interpretative value. Then, community-based and rural tourism spaces. In rural and traditional settings, adaptive reuse often involves the transformation of traditional houses, farm buildings, and vernacular architecture into homestays, eco-lodges, and community tourism centers. This type of adaptive reuse supports community-based tourism by directly involving local residents in tourism activities. It helps preserve vernacular architecture, sustain traditional lifestyles, and ensure that tourism benefits remain within the community. Then religious and sacred heritage reuse. Certain religious or sacred structures that are of no longer actively used for worship are adaptively reused for tourism purposes, such as cultural centers, museums, or heritage interpretation spaces. While such reuse requires sensitivity and respect, it allows preservation of sacred architecture and promotes cultural understanding among the visitors. This form of adaptive reuse contributes to spiritual and cultural tourism when managed ethically and inclusively. Then, military, prison, and conflict-related sites. Forts, barracks, prisons, and conflict-related structures are often reused as museums, memorials, or heritage tourism sites. These spaces interpret histories of war, colonialism, resistance, and political conflict. This type of adaptive reuse is particularly relevant to dark tourism and memory tourism, where visitors engage with the difficult past while ensuring that such sites are preserved and not forgotten. Now we shall move to the Indian case studies of adaptive reuse and tourism. India possesses an exceptionally rich and diverse heritage landscape shaped by centuries of dynasties' rule, colonial administration, religious traditions, and industrial development. Many historic structures across the country have lost their original functions due to political change, economic restructuring, or modernization. Adaptive reuse has therefore emerged as a crucial strategy to conserve these structures while integrating them into the tourism economy. Several Indian case studies demonstrate how adaptive reuse supports heritage conservation, sustainable tourism, and local development. Heritage Hotels of Rajasthan. One of the most successful examples of adaptive reuse in India is the conversion of royal palaces, forts, and havelis into heritage hotels, particularly in Rajasthan. Structures that once served as royal residence or defensive forts were rendered obstacle after the integration of princely states into independent India. For example, Umaid Bhawan Palace in Jodhpur, Lake Palace in Udaipur, Nimrara Fort Palace, etc. These buildings were adaptively reused to provide luxury accommodation while preserving architectural splendor, traditional craftsmanship, and historical ambience. Tourism revenue generated through heritage hotels has enabled the maintenance of these structures and created employment for local communities. This model demonstrates how adaptive reuse can successfully combine heritage conservation with high-value tourism. Colonial-era buildings reused as museums and cultural institutions. Across India, many colonial administrative buildings have been adaptively reused as museums, archives, and cultural centers. These structures, originally designed for governance, now functions as spaces for education or public engagement. For example, Victoria Memorial at Calcutta, functioning as museum and tourist attraction. Government buildings repurposed as state museums and cultural institutions. Railway heritage buildings converted into museums. Such reuse preserves colonial architectural heritage while retaining it within a past colonial narrative. These sites attract both domestic and international tourists interested in history, architecture, and cultural heritage. Havelis and heritage homestays. In regions like Rajasthan, Gujarat, and parts of Uttar Pradesh, traditional havelis have been adaptively reused as heritage homestays and boutique accommodations. Many of these residents were abandoned due to migration and changing lifestyle. Adaptive reuse has allowed these structures to be restored and reintegrated into local economies through tourism. Homestays provide visitors with immense cultural experiences while generating income for local families. This form of adaptive reuse supports community-based tourism and helps preserve vernacular architecture and traditional lifestyles. Then industrial heritage and urban reuse. India's industrial heritage, though often neglected, is increasingly being recognized for its tourism potential. Old textile mills, warehouses, and industrial complexes, particularly in cities like Mumbai and Ahmedabad, have been partially adaptively reused as cultural spaces, museums, or commercial hubs. While some projects have faced challenges related to commercialization and displacement, they highlight the possibilities of industrial heritage tourism in urban contexts. These sites interpret India's industrial past and contribute to urban regenerations. Then religious and sacred heritage reuse. Certain religious structures and heritage sites that are no longer actively used for worship have been adaptively reused as heritage tourism and interpretation spaces, while maintaining their sacred character. For example, monasteries and temple complexes functioning as cultural centers. Heritage city integrated into pilgrimage tourism. Such reuse requires careful planning and sensitivity, but it ensures the preservation of religious architecture and promotes cultural understanding among the visitors. Military and fort heritage tourism. India's numerous forts, barracks, and military structures, many of which lost their strategic importance, have been adaptively reused as tourism attractions, museums, and cultural venues. For example, forts reused for sound and light shows, barracks converted into museums or visitor centers. These sites contribute to historical tourism and memory tourism, enabling visitors to engage with India's military and political history. Now moving to the global case studies of adaptive reuse and tourism. Across the world, adaptive reuse have been widely adopted as an effective strategy to conserve heritage structures while integrating them into contemporary tourism economies. Many countries have successfully transformed obsolete industrial sites, military installations, religious buildings, and civic structures into vibrant tourism destinations. These global case studies highlight how adaptive reuse supports heritage conservation, urban regeneration, sustainable tourism, and experimental travel. One of the most elaborate examples of adaptive reuse globally is the Tate Modern in London. Originally built as a bankside power station, the structure became obsolete due to the changes in the energy production. Instead of demolishing it, the building was adaptively reused and reopened in 2000 as a modern art museum. The Jesse Zollverein coal mine complex in Essen, Germany, represents a landmark in industrial heritage reuse. Once a major coal mining site, it was closed due to industrial decline. Recognized for its architectural and historical significance, the complex was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Alkerts Islands, once a notorious federal prison, has been adaptively reused as a major heritage tourism site. After the prison's closure, the site was preserved and developed as a part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Today, it functions as a museum and memorial site that interpret its complex history, including incarnation, resistance, and civil rights. The adaptive reuse of this site reflects the growing importance of drug tourism and memory tourism. where visitors engage with difficult and contested past in an educational and ethical manner. Then, the London Docklands represent a large-scale adaptive reuse project involving former dockyards and warehouses that had become redundant due to changes in shipping technology. Through plant regeneration, these industrial spaces were converted into mixed-use area including tourism, leisure, residential, and commercial functions. Across Europe, declining congregations have led to the adaptive reuse to churches and monasteries. Many historic religious buildings have been converted into museums, libraries, hotels, and cultural centers while preserving their architectural integrity. Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park in Japan, the preservation and adaptive reuse of structures around the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, including the atomic bomb dome, reflect a sensitive approach to reuse within dark tourism. While not reused for commercial purposes, surrounded buildings have been adopted as museums and interpretation centers. Now, ethical, cultural, and planning challenges in adaptive reuse and tourism. While adaptive reuse is widely recognized as an effective strategy for heritage conservation and sustainable tourism, it also presents a range of ethical, cultural, and planning challenges. If not carefully managed, adaptive reuse can lead to loss of authenticity, cultural misinterpretation, social exclusion, and unsustainable tourism development. Therefore, a critical understanding of these challenges is essential for responsible heritage and tourism management. One of the most significant ethical issues in adaptive reuse relates to the commercialization of heritage. When historic buildings were converted into tourism facilities such as luxury hotels, restaurants, or entertainment spaces, there is a risk that economic objectives may override conservation values. Excessive commercialization can challenge history and reduce heritage to a marketable commodity. This challenge becomes particularly sensitive in the case of dark tourism sites, such as prisons, battlefields, or palaces associated with suffering and trauma. Reusing such sites for tourism must be approached with respect and sensitivity. Then, cultural challenge. Adaptive reuse can significantly affect local culture and identity. Heritage buildings are not merely physical structures, they are deeply embedded in the cultural memory and social practices of the communities. When adaptive reuse projects are designed particularly for tourists, they may ignore or marginalize local cultural values. One major cultural challenge is cultural homogenization. Many reused heritage spaces adopt standardized tourism aesthetics, boutique hotels, cafes, or galleries that cater to global tastes rather than local traditions. This can result in the loss of regional distinctness and cultural depth. Additionally, adaptive reuse may lead to the displacement of local communities, especially in historic urban areas. Rising property values and tourism-driven development can force residents and traditional users out of heritage precincts, weakening the living cultural fabric that gives heritage its meaning. Planning and management challenges. From a planning perspective, adaptive reuse requires a delicate balance between conservation regulations, tourism development, and urban needs. Many heritage structures are protected by strict laws that limit alternations, making adaptive reuse technically and administratively complex. Lack of coordination among stakeholders, that is, such as government agencies, conservation experts, private investors, and local communities, often result in poorly planned projects. Inadequate heritage impact assessment and absence of long-term management plans can lead to unsustainable tourism pressure on reuse sites. Another critical challenge is the exclusion of local communities from decision-making process. When adaptive reuse projects are planned without community consultation, they may fail to address the local needs and expectations. This can result in resistance, loss of trust, and social conflict. Balancing tourism, pressure, and conservation. In popular tourist destinations, adaptive reuse can intensify tourism pressure on heritage sites. Overcrowding, wear and tear, the environmental degradation threaten the physical integrity of reuse structures. Managing visitor numbers and ensuring responsible tourist behavior are ongoing challenges. Adaptive reuse must therefore be supported by visitor management strategies, monitoring mechanisms, and conservation-oriented maintenance practices. Then, role of the stakeholders and policy framework in adaptive reuse and tourism. Adaptive reuse of heritage buildings for tourism is a complex process that requires the coordinated involvement of multiple stakeholders and a supportive policy framework. Successful adaptive reuse is not solely an architectural or economic exercise. It is a government-driven process that balances heritage conservation, tourism development, community interest, and sustainability goals. The role of the stakeholders and policy frameworks are therefore central to ensuring ethical, inclusive, and effective outcomes. Then local communities are the key stakeholders because they are the custodians of living heritage. Their knowledge, traditions, and daily interactions give meaning to the heritage buildings. In adaptive reuse, community involvement is essential for identifying cultural appropriate uses, preserving intangible heritage and local identity, ensuring inequitable distribution of tourism benefits. Participatory planning approaches that include consultations, community participations, and capacity building initiatives enhance social acceptance and sustainability of reuse projects. Now, moving to the conclusion of this lecture, adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse has emerged as one of the most promising and forward-looking approaches in the field of heritage tourism. As historic buildings were across the world face challenges of neglect, functional obsolescence, development pressure, and adaptive reuse offers a sustainable pathway that reconciles heritage conservation with contemporary tourism needs, rather than threatening heritage as a static remnant of the past. Adaptive reuse recognizes it as a living and evolving resource capable of supporting economic, social, and cultural development. In the context of heritage tourism, adaptive reuse transforms historic structures into meaningful tourism spaces such as heritage hotels, museums, cultural centers, and community-based tourism facilities, while retaining their architectural integrity and historical significance. This approach responds to the growing demand for authentic and experimental tourism, where visitors seek deeper engagement with history, culture, and place. By enabling tourists to inhabit and interact with heritage environment, adaptive reuse enhances both visitors' experience and heritage appreciations. Looking toward the future, adaptive reuse aligns closely with the principles of sustainable tourism. Environmentally, it minimizes, reduces consumptions, reduces constructions wastage, and limits urban sprawl. Economically, it ensures the financial viability of heritage conservation by generating revenues and employment. Socially and culturally, it safeguards local identity, preserves collective memory, and promotes community participations. These combined benefits position adaptive reuse as a cornerstone of responsible tourism development. However, the future success of adaptive reuse in heritage tourism depends on ethical planning, inclusive governance, and strong policy support. Balancing commercialization with authenticity, tourism growth with conservation, and visitor depends with community interest remains a crucial challenge. Addressing these issues requires collaboration among government, heritage institutions, tourism planners, private stakeholders, and local communities, guided by conservation and ethics and sustainability frameworks. In conclusion, adaptive reuse represents not merely a conservation strategy, but a visitor for the future of heritage tourism. One that values continuity over destruction, reuse over replacement, and engagement over exploitation. By allowing heritage to adapt to changing times without losing its essence, adaptive reuse ensures that historic places remain relevant for the future generations. As such, adaptive reuse stands at the intersection of heritage preservation and tourism innovations, shaping a more sustainable and culturally responsible future for heritage tourism. Thank you very much.